The night Adira arrived at Blackthorn Plantation, the air felt wrong, too still, too heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The wagon creaked to a stop, its wheels sinking into the muddy soil, and the other captives trembled as the gates loomed open. But she didn't tremble. She stepped down slowly, her bare feet touching the ground with a strange, deliberate grace, her eyes drifting upward to the looming porch lights like she already knew the place. The men who escorted her laughed about her quietness, mistaking it for fear, but there was nothing fearful in the way she watched them. Her gaze was patient, measured, as if she was already learning them every weakness, every insecurity, every crack she would one day slip through. The plantation stretched out before her, sprawling and restless, a maze of fields, shadows, and old secrets buried beneath centuries of cruelty. The wind carried faint whispers from the quarters where exhausted voices murmured stories of the past, stories of ghosts and curses and masters who disappeared without explanation. Adira listened to these whispers as she walked, her expression unreadable, but something inside her seemed to sharpen, like a blade being honed. She had heard stories like these before. She had survived estates far darker than this one. And she had burned bridges no one ever traced back to her. When the overseer grabbed her arm to pull her forward, she didn't flinch. Instead, she looked directly at him, calm, almost analytical, until a flicker of unease passed across his face. He let go, muttering under his breath, trying to shake off a chill he couldn't name. Adira tilted her head slightly, as if testing how much sway she already had, then continued walking with the same eerie composure. Every lantern she passed cast a tremor of light across her face, revealing features that did not soften, did not reveal fear, did not belong to someone who considered herself powerless. From the balcony above, the master watched her arrival with unusual interest. His grip tightened on the railing, disturbed by the feeling that this new woman moved not like a victim stepping into captivity, but like someone entering a familiar playing field. Someone who had been here before, in spirit if not in flesh. And when Adira paused beneath the balcony and looked up at him, their eyes locking for a moment that felt far too long, the master stepped back as though confronted by a future he did not yet understand. Adira lowered her gaze again and resumed walking, her silhouette swallowed by the dark. But even the darkness seemed to yield to her, parting for her path. Whatever she had come here to do, whatever path she intended to carve into the heart of Blackthorn Plantation, she had already taken her first step, and the land, the master, and every soul trapped upon it would soon learn that she was not a woman to be owned. She was a woman with a plan. A plan she had executed before. A plan she intended to complete again. Adira's arrival in chains was nothing like the overseers expected, and certainly nothing like the other captives experienced. The wagon rattled through the thick forest path leading to Blackthorn Plantation, every jolt sending shivers through the people chained beside her, yet she remained impossibly composed. While the others stared at the dirt or cried out prayers swallowed by the trees, Adira kept her gaze lifted, observing every bend in the road, every fence post, every guard's nervous habit. There was no defeat in her eyes, only calculation, like she was memorizing the route not to escape, but to understand the place she would soon manipulate. When the plantation finally came into view, the others recoiled at the towering gates and the sprawling fields drenched in the color of labor and misery, yet a strange calm settled over Adira as if she had expected something far worse than this. The guards surrounding them barked orders, dragging the newly arrived enslaved people from the wagon like sacks of grain, but Adira stepped down quietly, almost gracefully, never once resisting or stumbling. One of the men nudged her shoulder as if testing whether she would panic or fight, and when she didn't react, he muttered that she must be too frightened to speak. But beneath her controlled exterior, her mind had already begun cataloguing the hierarchy of the plantation, the overseer with the limp who likely compensated for his weakness with cruelty, the younger guard who kept glancing at her with discomfort rather than dominance, and the older driver who seemed more tired than malicious. These details would matter later. The other captives whispered warnings to each other, their voices trembling with fear as they were separated into groups, but Adira remained silent, listening, absorbing every sound. She caught the distant hum of voices from the slave quarters, the sharp crack of a whip somewhere across the field, and the heavy, slow footsteps of the plantation owner approaching to inspect his new labor. The air shifted as he neared, thick with the oppressive authority he carried like a second skin, but even he hesitated when he saw her. Adira noticed the hesitation instantly. She had seen it before, this subtle faltering from men who sensed something they could not name. Not danger, exactly, but the unsettling awareness that the person before them was not what she appeared to be. As she stood under the master's scrutiny, her posture did not shrink the way the others did. She simply waited, still and unreadable, allowing him to project whatever assumptions he wished, all while she quietly assessed him in return. Her arrival was meant to mark the beginning of her captivity, but in her mind, it was the first move on a board she had already begun to study, and the men around her had no idea they were participating in a game she planned to win. From the moment Adira was brought through the gates of Blackthorn Plantation, she understood that brute resistance would get her nowhere, but manipulation, quiet, precise, and invisible, could become her greatest weapon. The overseer assigned to monitor the new arrivals was a man known for breaking spirits within hours, yet Adira chose him as her first target. She watched him closely as he shouted orders, pushing people into lines and striking those who reacted too slowly. He thrived on fear, on the trembling of those who couldn't hide their terror, and Adira saw immediately how easily she could use that against him. When he approached her, expecting the same panicked obedience he had extracted from countless others, Adira lowered her eyes and allowed her breath to tremble just enough to make him believe she feared him deeply. She didn't cower, but she offered the illusion of fragility, the kind that made men like him feel powerful. It worked instantly. His voice lowered, his posture loosened. He believed he had already dominated her, and that belief made him careless. As days passed, Adira continued feeding him the version of herself he expected, meek, quiet, seemingly overwhelmed by her new environment. But beneath that mask, she studied him relentlessly. She noticed he struggled with his knee, a weakness hidden beneath forced bravado. She noticed he held grudges easily, reacting with petty cruelty to anyone who accidentally stepped out of line. And most importantly, she noticed he liked to talk when he felt superior. So she gave him opportunities to speak. She pretended not to understand instructions so he could correct her. She allowed herself to appear confused so he would lecture her. With every word he spilled, she gained insight into the plantation's schedules, the favoritism among the workers, and the tensions he had with the other overseers. All of this information was ammunition she stored quietly. What truly cemented her influence over him, however, was the moment she pretended to flinch when another overseer yelled too close beside her. The reaction was subtle, but enough to trigger a territorial instinct in her target. He stepped in front of her, snapping at the other man to watch where he directed his voice. The exchange lasted seconds, but it revealed everything Adira needed to know. He was already beginning to think of her as someone under his control, someone he had to protect in order to maintain that illusion. From then on, he watched her more closely, not out of suspicion, but out of possessive pride. He started assigning her lighter tasks, claiming it was because she was too soft for the harder ones. Adira let him believe every word of his own reasoning, thankful he never noticed how her eyes sharpened whenever he turned away. In his mind, she had become the easiest to manage. In her mind, he had become the easiest to manipulate. In the early weeks of Adira's arrival, the quarters buzzed with the usual tensions that came from living under constant fear, old rivalries, quiet grudges, and whispered resentments that never had the space to heal. Most newcomers kept their heads down, but Adira listened, watched, and absorbed the way every conversation bent. She learned who obeyed out of terror, who obeyed out of loyalty, and who obeyed because they dreamed of surviving just one more day. She learned who envied whom, who mistrusted whom, and which small arguments had the potential to ignite something far larger. What others viewed as ordinary friction, she recognized as opportunity. She didn't need to create conflict from nothing. Conflict already lived in every corner of the plantation. All she needed to do was give it a small, invisible nudge. Her first move was subtle. She offered a single piece of carefully chosen information to a housemaid named Lila, a woman desperate to avoid returning to the fields. Adira accidentally let slip that the overseer disliked Lila's habit of whispering to others during work hours. Lila, believing she had received a warning, immediately distanced herself from the woman she often confided in. That woman, feeling abandoned, grew irritated and snapped at another worker. Within hours, the small circle of house servants was tense and divided, and no one suspected that the spark had come from Adira's quiet voice in the corner of the room. She didn't smile, didn't show victory, didn't act as though she had done anything. To them, she remained quiet and harmless. But she was far from finished. She noticed a group of field workers irritable and worn down after being overworked, while another group resented them for receiving slightly better food rations. A careless remark in the wrong ear, something as simple as "they said you think you're better," led to sharp words between the groups that rippled through the fields. Adira didn't linger to watch. She didn't need to. When conflict spread, she simply walked past with her usual calm expression, and everyone assumed she was too timid to involve herself in such matters. She hid her intelligence behind silence, understanding that invisible influence was far more powerful than obvious manipulation. Over time, small rifts widened. People who once relied on each other began questioning motives. Overseers noticed the rising tension but blamed fatigue, heat, or stubbornness. No one thought to look at the soft-spoken newcomer who rarely raised her voice. What made her most dangerous was that she never forced anything to happen. She simply amplified what was already there. By feeding existing insecurities, she made herself indispensable, someone people felt comfortable confiding in, someone who seemed trustworthy precisely because she never appeared eager to speak. And yet everything she said, every quiet suggestion she made, was a single drop of poison slowly spreading through the veins of the plantation. It happened slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but the plantation owner began to notice Adira in a way he didn't notice anyone else. He had seen thousands of enslaved people pass through his land, each one worn down by fear, hunger, or despair. But Adira, he summoned her under the pretense of questioning her work habits, expecting her to stammer or shrink. But when she stood before him, she was steady, composed, her expression unreadable. She answered his questions with quiet politeness, never too quick, never too bold, yet her eyes stayed clear and focused on his face. The exchange lasted only minutes, but it lingered in his mind for hours afterward. It angered him that he couldn't decipher her, that he couldn't sense fear where he expected it, and that her presence left him with a feeling he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. That curiosity grew into something heavier, an interest he didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't seem to avoid. He told himself it was suspicion, perhaps even caution, but deep down he knew it was neither. Adira's composure had burrowed under his skin, and with every passing day, she became less a face in the crowd and more a presence he couldn't look away from. Adira understood that true chaos never erupted from loud, dramatic moments, it came from quiet fractures, from tensions stretched thin until they snapped in the dark. That was the kind of chaos she needed, the kind that left no fingerprints. And on Blackthorn Plantation, she didn't need to invent hostility. It already simmered between the two highest-ranking overseers, Hale and Corbin. Hale was older, carrying a reputation built on cruelty and fear. Corbin was younger, ambitious, desperate to prove himself, and increasingly irritated by Hale's authority. Their rivalry was something everyone sensed but no one dared discuss. Adira noticed it almost immediately, and she knew how to accelerate it without ever lifting a hand. The opportunity arrived one humid afternoon. While working near the barn, Adira overheard Corbin grumbling about Hale's incompetence, making comments sharp enough to cut but quiet enough that he thought no one else heard. She didn't react, didn't pause, but tucked the words away. Later that evening, while Hale inspected the workers, Adira allowed herself to appear nervous, glancing over her shoulder as though hiding something. Hale's suspicion was predictable. He confronted her harshly, demanding to know what she was so afraid of. Adira spoke softly, hesitating just enough to appear reluctant, then mentioned she had overheard Corbin saying Hale wasn't fit to lead the fields anymore. She phrased it carefully, letting Hale fill in the rest with his own insecurities. Hale's eyes darkened, and though he dismissed her, she watched the seed she planted settle deep in his mind. From that moment, the smallest disagreements between Hale and Corbin grew brutal. Orders clashed. Whispers spread. Workers were caught in the crossfire of their unspoken feud. Adira observed it all from a distance, never too close, never too involved. When Corbin later demanded to know why Hale had been undermining him publicly, Adira happened to be nearby, quiet as a shadow. She listened to Corbin rant, his pride wounded, his anger rising. When he turned to her, asking whether she had noticed Hale's hostility, she responded with a small, uncertain nod, the kind that could mean everything or nothing. Corbin heard exactly what he wanted. Within days, the plantation floor trembled with tension. Hale accused Corbin of incompetence during a critical harvest task. Corbin retaliated by reporting Hale's knee injury to the master, suggesting he was no longer physically capable of performing his duties. The master, already irritated by declining productivity, dismissed Hale temporarily, claiming it was for health reasons. Hale, humiliated and furious, blamed Corbin openly, and their rivalry exploded into visible animosity. Workers whispered, overseers divided, and the plantation's once rigid structure faltered. Adira watched the unraveling carefully. She had not lied outright. She had not started the fire. She had only redirected the sparks that were already falling. And as Hale's authority crumbled and Corbin's paranoia grew, she understood that she had achieved exactly what she needed, a fracture in the system that weakened both sides, giving her even more room to move unseen. Rumors on a plantation often traveled faster than truth, but whenever they touched Adira's name, the whispers seemed to come wrapped in unease. People sensed something about her, something they couldn't articulate, long before anyone uncovered even a fragment of her past. It began with a traveling merchant who visited Blackthorn to sell tools and medicines. He noticed Adira carrying crates near the storage shed and froze as though he had seen a ghost. He didn't say her name aloud, but the look in his eyes lingered long after he left, and the workers who witnessed the moment couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than the silence she carried. The merchant spoke quietly to the master later that day, mentioning an estate that had burned down months before, a tragedy whispered about in southern towns. The owner of that estate had died in the fire, along with 2 overseers, and though the cause was blamed on a lantern accident, no one ever found the one enslaved woman missing from the ashes. The master didn't connect the details immediately, but the idea lodged itself in his mind. The plantation workers, however, sensed the connection much sooner. They began quietly questioning who Adira had been before she arrived. She never offered answers, only a calm smile or a deflection, but that silence made people more curious. Someone recalled seeing a scorch mark on her wrist, not the mark of a punishment, but something older, something that looked like it had healed without proper care. Another noticed the way she instinctively positioned herself near exits, as though she had learned to survive by anticipating danger. And some swore that she had spoken to the land itself one evening, whispering into the soil as if sharing secrets with the earth. These stories were small, but on a place like Blackthorn, small stories grew into something larger. The master, driven partly by curiosity and partly by the uneasy warnings from the merchant, asked a few discreet questions in nearby towns. What he discovered unsettled him. People described the burned estate with fear, speaking of the mysterious woman who had disappeared without a trace. They said she was intelligent, too intelligent, and that she had a way of making people trust her without understanding why. They mentioned strange conflicts that had escalated suddenly just before the fire, conflicts no one could explain. Though he didn't want to believe the quiet woman walking his fields could be the same person, he began noticing how similar patterns had begun unfolding on his own land: arguments, tension, loyalties shifting without obvious cause. Adira never reacted to these whispers, but she heard them. She always heard everything. And though her face remained calm, the flicker in her eyes revealed something else. She knew her past would eventually reach Blackthorn, but she was not afraid. If anything, she seemed prepared for it, as though the unveiling of her history was merely another step in a plan she had set into motion long before anyone realized they were characters in a story she had already begun writing. The master of Blackthorn Plantation had always ruled through dominance, fear, and the relentless weight of his reputation, but beneath all that power lived a single fragile flaw he kept buried from everyone: an overwhelming fear of losing control. Control over the land, over his workers, over the legacy his father had left him. That legacy was the only thing that made him feel significant, the only shield against the emptiness he carried when the fields grew quiet at night. Adira noticed this fear long before anyone else did. She recognized it in the way his eyes lingered on dying crops a moment too long, in the way he snapped when reports from the fields showed the slightest decline, in the restless pacing he did after arguments with overseers. These small cracks were invisible to most, but to her, they were entry points, doorways into a mind that could be influenced with the right pressure. She began her approach indirectly, never speaking to him more than necessary, never appearing eager for his attention. Instead, she allowed him to overhear certain conversations. Sometimes she would talk quietly with other workers about how the soil seemed to resist the new planting schedule. Other times she would mention how the overseer's rivalry was making the fields less productive. None of it sounded like sabotage, it sounded like concern. But each carefully placed comment fed directly into his deepest fear that he was losing his grip on the plantation. He started asking questions, subtle at first, then more persistent, trying to understand how things had begun to slip. When he approached Adira for her perspective, she responded with polite uncertainty, giving him just enough truth to appear honest while withholding enough to keep him unsettled. He began to rely on her observations in small, unspoken ways. He lingered near her when she worked, pretending to inspect the fields but watching her reactions instead. He asked her opinions on matters he would never discuss with an enslaved person, disguising his questions as idle conversation. Adira never offered solutions, she simply stated what she saw, weaving her words gently around his insecurities. She let him draw his own conclusions, guiding him without ever appearing to steer. As the tension between overseers worsened and productivity faltered, the master's fear intensified. He felt the plantation slipping from his control, and the only person who seemed to see the problems with the clarity he lacked was Adira. Her calmness in the midst of chaos soothed him, making him believe she understood the land better than anyone else. What he didn't realize was that her calmness was deliberate, designed to make her appear steady in all the places where he faltered. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, his need for control twisted into reliance, and that reliance twisted into trust, the very thread Adira intended to pull when the moment was right. The disappearances began quietly, slipping into the rhythms of plantation life the way a shadow slips beneath a door, unnoticed until it is too late. Adira never lifted a hand against anyone, never raised her voice, never even appeared involved, yet the timing was too precise to be coincidence. The first to vanish was a field hand known for spreading rumors, a man who had grown suspicious of the sudden tension between overseers and the strange calmness Adira carried everywhere she went. One evening he whispered to another worker that Adira wasn't right, that something about her didn't belong to this place. By morning, he was gone. People assumed he had run, though no one could explain why he would flee without food, tools, or a plan. Adira said nothing, simply watching as worry crept into the quarters like a cold wind. Next was a guard who often lingered near Adira with questions that dipped too close to her past. He wasn't cruel, just curious, but curiosity had burned men long before this plantation existed. One night he fell ill without warning, violent chills, fever, delirium that made him hallucinate shadows moving across his walls. By dawn he was unable to speak, and by evening he had been removed from the property entirely, relocated to a neighboring estate to recover. He never returned. The other guards claimed it was disease, but the timing left many unsettled. Once again, Adira kept to herself, quiet and calm, offering help when asked but never seeking attention. The third disappearance was the one that made whispers turn into fear. Corbin, the younger overseer whose rivalry with Hale had escalated into open hostility, began spiraling into paranoia. He barely slept, convinced that someone was watching him at night. He snapped at workers, accusing them of plotting against him. He demanded extra patrols, ordered constant inspections, and avoided turning his back to anyone. Then one stormy night, he simply vanished. His horse remained in the stable. His boots sat by his door. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading into the fields, no splinters on the windowsill. The master sent men to search the forest, but they found nothing. Corbin had disappeared as though swallowed by the air. Fear swept through Blackthorn, tightening the atmosphere until every sound felt sharper. Workers murmured prayers. Overseers walked with their hands on their weapons. Even the master felt the weight of something he could not name. Through it all, Adira moved with the same quiet presence she always had, untouched by the panic around her, as though she had expected each disappearance long before it happened. She never smiled, never gloated, but behind her eyes there was a knowing stillness, a calm that suggested she understood these vanishings were not accidents or acts of nature. They were pieces shifting into place, one by one, clearing the board of dangers that stood between her and her next move. The shift in power began so subtly that no one noticed at first, like a change in temperature that creeps in without warning. With Corbin gone, the remaining overseers were thrown into disarray, suspicious of one another and afraid to take decisive action. Hale, once confident and sharp-tongued, started second-guessing himself, uncertain who he could trust or what invisible enemy stalked the plantation. The master, overwhelmed by the growing instability, turned instinctively toward the one person who seemed untouched by the chaos. He began speaking to Adira more often, seeking her perspective under the guise of casual conversation. She answered carefully, with the composed humility expected of an enslaved woman, yet her words always guided him toward decisions that benefited her and weakened others. She avoided giving orders but instead posed quiet observations, subtle phrases that planted doubt, softened tensions, or redirected blame. Her influence grew not by force, but by understanding what each man feared and where each crack already existed. The workers, too, sensed the change. Adira had seen their suffering, their exhaustion, their simmering desperation long before anyone else cared to notice, and she knew exactly how to speak to each of them. She offered encouragement in the right moments, diffused conflicts before they erupted, and shared rumors only when they served a purpose. She never claimed leadership, never called herself anything more than what she was, but people began looking toward her instinctively. A single glance from her could silence an argument. A single word could calm a frightened child. Even the elders, who had lived long enough to distrust hope, found themselves listening to her. By this time, some whispered that she carried protection from spirits, while others believed she possessed a rare intelligence that could read people like books. Whatever the truth, everyone agreed on one thing: the plantation reacted to her presence. If she walked into a room, voices lowered. If she passed a group of guards, their hands tightened around their guns without conscious thought. If the master looked her way, his expression softened in a manner no one had ever seen. The hierarchy that had once been carved into stone began warping around her, bending subtly in her direction. But Adira's rise was not built on charm or favor alone. Her growing influence came from something deeper, a quiet resilience that unnerved those who tried to control her. She had survived their cruelty, studied their weaknesses, and learned the rhythm of the plantation better than those who believed they ruled it. Now, as instability rippled through Blackthorn, every small advantage tilted toward her. The master asked for her counsel more frequently. Overseers avoided questioning her. Workers looked to her before acting. Power had begun to shift in her favor, not through violence or open rebellion, but through the steady, quiet gravity of a woman who had long understood that true control rarely needs to announce itself. As Rowena stepped into the grand halls of the master's mansion, she felt the weight of every eye that had ever looked down on her, doubted her, or dismissed her as nothing more than property. Yet now, with each step she took across the polished wooden floor, she carried the quiet power of someone who had climbed through shadows and thorns to stand where no one like her had ever stood before. But power, she quickly realized, did not end the dangers around her, it only changed their shape. Behind the silk curtains and crystal decanters, the mansion teemed with unseen tensions, resentments, and whispered threats, each lurking like a hungry predator waiting to pounce. The household staff watched her with expressions that could harden or soften depending on who might be looking, their loyalties wavering like candle flames in a draught. The elite visitors, the ones who came to dine, gossip, and exchange favors, didn't even bother hiding their disdain. Their eyes clung to her like cold fingers, measuring her, judging her, hunting for cracks. She knew they wondered how a slave had risen so far, so fast, and with so little explanation. Rowena sensed danger before she ever saw it. At night, she could feel the mansion shifting, the floorboards creaking with footsteps that stopped whenever she turned her head, the soft scrape of something being dragged across the hallway outside her room. Servants spoke to her politely in daylight, but their words dripped with coded warnings. One night, a housemaid placed a tray before her and whispered without meeting her eyes that not everyone in the mansion believed she belonged there. Another evening, a stable hand paused while tending to the horses and told her, in a trembling voice, that certain men had begun gathering quietly after sundown, exchanging stories about her past, stories no one should have known. Someone, it seemed, had been digging into her life on the plantation, searching for anything that could be used against her. Even the master's demeanor shifted in ways she struggled to read. He was still warm with her, still proud to have her at his side, but sometimes she caught him studying her too long, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. Some nights he held her close, promising her a future she'd never dared imagine. On others, he seemed lost in thought, more reserved, more cautious. She wondered if he, too, had heard the murmurs traveling through the walls, questions about her intentions, her sudden rise, and whether her presence signaled something more dangerous than ambition. Rowena understood then that marrying the master had not crowned her triumph. It had thrust her into the heart of a nest where every smile was a disguise, every shadow a warning, and every conversation a trap waiting to snap shut.